Denise Rowe.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to take a call for the Greens for the Gambling Amendment, Bill number 3, for the second reading. Sir, I'm not usually a member of the Government Administration Committee, but given that I'm the gambling spokesperson, I sat in on that committee for this bill in Mojo Maker's place. And I have to say it was a well-run committee and I thoroughly enjoyed the robust debates that we frequently had there. Mr Speaker, we received 126 written submissions and heard in person from 33 different submitters, and they can be roughly grouped into 3 different categories. First of all, there's the gambling societies and venue operators. Then there are those concerned about the impact of gambling on their communities and the individuals who'd been impacted by gambling as well. I always find it useful when I'm looking at a bill, sir, to, particularly an amendment bill, to look at the original Act which it is amending and look at the purpose of the bill and see whether the original Act is going to be impacted at all by the amendment bill. And, sir, that's what I've done in this case as well, if you'll bear with me. So the number 3 bill, as introduced to the House, was described as having the aims, and I think there were 4 of them, to increase transparency of grant making from the proceeds of Class 4 gambling, reduce potential conflicts of interest situations between Class 4 gambling operators, societies, venues and grant recipients, to improve transparency around surrounding management companies that provide societies with services, for example, contract negotiation with venues, administrative and financial management or grant application processing, to simplify compliance and reduce costs for societies and venue owners in some areas, and lastly, the 5th one, ensure the efficiency of the appeals process is not undermined. And it sounds great. This bill sounds great. And actually, most submitters agreed that increasing transparency in the grant-making process, reducing conflicts of interests, improving transparency with management companies, and having a more efficient appeals process, they're all worthy causes. But many submitters, sir, shared the concerns that I also have about the aim of the bill that is intended to, and I quote, simplify compliance and reduce costs for societies and venue owners in some areas. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. Now, if we measure that up against the original Act, the 2003 Gambling Act, the purpose, in part, just a few of them, a few of the purposes that I'll outline here. The purposes of that original Act is A, to control the growth of gambling, and B, prevent and minimise harm from gambling, including problem gambling. D, facilitate responsible gambling, and G, ensure that money from gambling benefits the community. Now, many submitters were extremely worried that if the Select Committee were to remove the clause in the original Act that prohibits commission-based payments for venue operators under the guise of simplifying compliance and reducing costs for societies and venue owners, that the bill would undermine the original intent of the Act to prevent and minimise gambling harm, facilitate responsible gambling, and ensure that the money goes to the community. Because basically, sir, if venues can be paid by commission, there's an incentive for the venue operator to ensure that people continue to gamble as much as possible. It means that host responsibility programs could easily be compromised by unscrupulous venue operators wanting to maximise the return on the machines that they've got on their premises. Now, we already know, sir, that Class 4 venues, that in those venues, host responsibility offered to gamblers on pokie machines can be sadly lacking. And many submitters pointed to the mystery shopper experiment carried out by the Department of Internal Affairs, the compliance teams there at the end of last year. And this is the experiment where they went to 102 different venues, gambling venues, and they had mystery shoppers pretend to display the kind of behaviours that you would see with someone experiencing problems with their gambling or little control over their gambling behaviour. And only one out of those 102 venues actually intervened, displayed good host responsibility. Now, I think we have to congratulate the Department of Internal Affairs for taking that proactive response on compliance. Now, without a doubt, the current system of paying venues, which is covered by very strict regulations, they can be very complicated. But the current system relies on venue operators being paid actual, reasonable and necessary costs. And I also want to note that the Department of Internal Affairs have been very busy since 2009 working with gambling societies on standardising venue cost schedules during what they called their resubmission project. And their 2013 report included recommendations around the calculation of venue payments, including calling for a full review and to initially adjust limits to cover wages, increases and inflation. The recommendations, however, sir, did not in any way suggest the radical and really risky move of removing the restriction on paying venues by commission. I note also that the department's project resulted in the best data they said they'd ever received. But they also said that the work they did on that was set aside when this bill when they started to work on this bill. So I think we have to remember that the money that goes to venue operators and gambling societies is money that is not going to the community. It's money that's not going to the Life Saving Club. It's money that's not going to sports or education organisations. And this bill, presumably, is about wanting to increase the amount of money that the community uses. So it doesn't really make sense to have a commission-based payment system. Mr. Speaker, the Greens are also very concerned about extending licences to operators for 3 years as an incentive for good behaviour. And I guess we'd feel a whole lot better about that had there been more pokie venues displaying good behaviour during the mystery shopper experiment. We know that compliance can be very poor in this sector, and I would suggest that those provisions in the bill be set aside, put on hold until the industry shows that it can be responsible. So when the bill came to the House, my colleague Kevin Haigh spoke on it as I was away, and we said that commission-based payments would be a deal breaker for the Greens. And despite the convincing arguments from submitters, the Select Committee has by majority decided to keep those provisions in. We will be putting forward supplementary order papers on this issue, as will colleagues from Labor, because we're really concerned that the venue commission payment system will, without a doubt, increase problem gambling. When we've got, sir, an estimated 40% of the money, all the money that's lost on the pokies, coming from people with little control over their gambling behaviour, this is how the money for communities and charities is made. When we've got 40% of that coming from people with gambling problems, then I think we need to do better than what we're doing in this bill and open those people up to more gambling rather than less. And equally bad, sir, is the fact that this bill is a lost opportunity to actually really do something about problem gambling, like introducing a pre-commit card system that would allow people without harmful behaviours to have a flutter without the risk of becoming problem gamblers. It would become a huge handbrake for anybody who was at risk of becoming a problem gambler. And this, sir, is a better and cheaper solution to problem gambling, to facial recognition technology, which actually acts as a way of stopping people who have already got the problem gambling behaviours. So the pokey machines have already sucked them dry. So we've lost that opportunity to introduce some good gambling harm prevention measures and things like player time, real-time player tracking, which would also look at how people are behaving while they're at the machines. If this government was serious about dealing with gambling harm, then it would take the opportunity to fix what has become a dangerous product. So as it stands, sir, we cannot support this bill, and we encourage every other party to also vote against it.
Clayton Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise on behalf of New Zealand First to take a call on the second reading